The Bible says they were destroyed, not defeated, not absorbed, not pushed aside in the gradual way that most ancient peoples were displaced by the civilizations that replaced them. Destroyed. The book of Joshua describes a campaign of deliberate extermination, city by city across the land of Canaan, commanded by God and carried out by the armies of Israel. The Canaanites, in this telling, were a people so morally corrupt that their complete annihilation was not just permitted, but required. They were to leave no survivors. Their culture was to be erased. Their name was to become a synonym for everything that the new civilization of Israel defined itself against. For centuries, this account shaped how scholars, theologians, and eventually archaeologists approached the question of who the Canaanites were and what happened to them. The biblical narrative was taken as historical framework, even by researchers who recognized that it was also theological argument. The Canaanites were the people before, the people who had to go. In 2017, two things happened simultaneously. A team of researchers led by Mark Haber at the Wellcome Sanger Institute published the first comprehensive ancient DNA study of Canaanite individuals, recovering genomes from Bronze Age skeletons excavated at the ancient city of Sidon in Lebanon. And a headline appeared in newspapers around the world announcing that the study had disproved the Bible. Neither the study nor its findings justified that headline, but the reaction to both the science and the misreporting of it revealed something important about why this particular ancient DNA finding touched such sensitive nerves. The DNA did not disprove the Bible, it did something more interesting and more consequential. It showed that the Canaanites never disappeared. The ancient city of Sidon sits on the Lebanese coast, a few kilometers south of modern Saida, one of Lebanon's major cities. It was one of the great Phoenician city-states, but before it was Phoenician, it was Canaanite, and the cemetery beneath its ancient layers held the remains of people who lived there during the Bronze Age, roughly 3,700 years ago, at the height of Canaanite civilization. The 2017 study extracted ancient DNA from the skeletal remains of 5 Canaanite individuals from the Sidon cemetery. The genetic analysis of these 5 people produced a profile that was, broadly speaking, consistent with what the geography of the ancient Levant would predict. Their ancestry derived primarily from the Neolithic farming populations of the ancient Near East, the same Iranian farmer-related and Anatolian populations that shaped much of the genetic landscape of the ancient Middle East. They showed some admixture with populations from the Eurasian steppe, the same steppe-related ancestry that had spread across much of Europe and Western Asia during the Bronze Age, though in proportions lower than what was found in most European populations of the same period. In this basic genetic profile, the ancient Canaanites looked like Levantine people. They were neither dramatically different from, nor dramatically similar to the ancient populations of Egypt, or Mesopotamia, or Anatolia. They were the people of the eastern Mediterranean coast, shaped by the same broad population movements that had shaped the entire region. The finding that generated the headlines was not the profile of the ancient individuals themselves. It was what happened when their genomes were compared to modern populations. The modern population that showed the highest genetic continuity with the ancient Canaanites of Sidon was the modern Lebanese population. Not approximately, not in a general way that required significant statistical qualification. The modern Lebanese showed a level of genetic continuity with the Bronze Age Canaanites that indicated they were, in a very real sense, the direct descendants of those people. The study estimated that approximately 90% of the ancestry of modern Lebanese populations derives from the ancient Canaanite population. This was the finding that mattered, because the biblical account of the destruction of the Canaanites, taken as literal history, predicted that there should be no Canaanite descendants. The DNA said there were, millions of them, living in the same geographic territory their ancestors had inhabited 3,000 years ago, carrying the same genetic heritage, maintaining a biological continuity that neither conquest nor conversion, nor the passage of 3 millennia had interrupted. The biblical narrative describes an extermination. The genome describes a continuity. These two things cannot both be entirely true. The resolution, of course, is that most serious biblical scholars have not taken the Joshua account as literal history for well over a century. The archaeological record of the Bronze Age to Iron Age transition in Canaan does not support a campaign of systematic extermination followed by Israelite replacement. The destruction layers that appear at some sites are not uniform in date or in character. Many Canaanite cities show no destruction layers at all. The material culture continuity between the Bronze Age Canaanite and the Iron Age Israelite periods is substantial, suggesting a much more gradual and complex process of cultural transformation than the military narrative of Joshua implies. The DNA is the biological confirmation of what the archaeology had long suggested. The Canaanites did not disappear. They became, through processes of cultural change, political reorganization, and religious transformation, the people who are now called by other names. But the story does not end with Lebanon. The 2017 study compared the ancient Canaanite genomes not only to modern Lebanese, but to a broader range of modern populations from across the Levant and the Middle East. And what it found was that the Canaanite genetic heritage is not confined to Lebanon. It is distributed across the populations of the entire Levant, present in measurable proportions in modern Syrian, Jordanian, Palestinian, and Israeli Arab populations, and in smaller but detectable proportions in populations further afield. This finding sits at the intersection of ancient genetics and contemporary political conflict in ways that are unavoidable. The modern Israeli-Palestinian conflict is, among many other things, a conflict over historical presence and legitimacy in a piece of land. Both sides of the conflict have used historical narratives to support claims about who belongs in the land and who does not. The ancient DNA of the Canaanites, the people who were there before the period of documented Israelite presence, is not neutral evidence in this context. What the DNA shows is that the populations who today identify as Palestinian Arabs, as Israeli Arabs, as Lebanese, as Jordanians, carry genetic heritage from the ancient Canaanite population. They are, in the most direct biological sense, the descendants of the people who were living in this land before the narratives of both Judaism and Islam claim their founding moments. This does not resolve any contemporary political question. Ancestry does not determine rights. The history of the human species is a history of migration and displacement and mixing that makes simple claims of ancestral ownership of specific territories genomically incoherent. But it is a fact, established by the ancient DNA, that the Canaanites are not gone. Their biological legacy persists in the living populations of the modern Levant. There is a further layer to this that the 2017 study and subsequent research have illuminated. The Canaanite genetic heritage did not stay in the Levant. The Phoenicians, whom we have already encountered in this series, carried Canaanite ancestry across the Mediterranean in their trading ships. The ancient Canaanites and the Phoenicians are not two separate peoples. The Phoenicians are the Canaanites of the coastal cities in the Iron Age, the same population that the DNA shows continuous with modern Lebanese, now extending their genetic reach across the Mediterranean through their extraordinary maritime commercial activity, which means that the Canaanite genetic legacy is not only in the modern Levant, it is in Malta, where the Phoenician genetic signal is strongest in any modern Mediterranean population. It is in Tunisia, where Carthage preserved it. It is, in smaller proportions, in Sardinia, in Spain, in the populations that the Phoenician trading network touched across the ancient Mediterranean world. The people the Bible said were to be destroyed became some of the most genetically widespread people in the ancient world, their heritage distributed across a vast arc of territory by the trading civilization that was their direct cultural and biological descendant. The reaction to the 2017 study illustrated the difficulty of doing ancient DNA research in politically charged territory. The headline claiming the study had disproved the Bible was followed by rapid corrections from the researchers themselves, who pointed out that their study made no claims about biblical historicity and that their findings were entirely compatible with mainstream scholarly understanding of the Bible as a complex text that mixed historical memory with theological purpose and narrative elaboration. But the corrections received less attention than the original headline, and the study entered the public discourse in a simplified and distorted form that served no one's understanding of either the science or the history. What the study actually showed was something that deserved to be taken seriously on its own terms, without the biblical framing. A Bronze Age population in the ancient Levant maintained remarkable genetic continuity with the modern populations of the same region across 3,000 years of conquest, conversion, and cultural transformation. The armies that passed through, the empires that rose and fell, the religions that replaced one another, all left their marks in the culture, the language, and the material record of the Levant. But the underlying biological population persisted. The Canaanites, defined by their genomic heritage rather than their cultural label, are still here. There is something worth dwelling on in this finding, in the context of a series that has traced the stories of populations across the ancient world. The Canaanites are, in the popular imagination shaped by the biblical narrative, the archetypal victims of righteous destruction, the people whose elimination was not just permitted, but commanded, the negative space against which Israel was defined. The DNA refuses this framing, not by defending the Canaanites or attacking the biblical narrative, but simply by showing that the destruction did not happen in the way the story required it to. The people survived. They changed their names and their religions and sometimes their languages, as people do when empires come and go, but their biological continuity persisted. The genome is indifferent to the theological argument about whether their destruction was justified. It simply records that it did not occur. The modern Lebanese person carrying 90% Canaanite ancestry did not choose to be the biological refutation of an ancient theological narrative. They are simply the living continuation of a human population that was there before the stories about their destruction were written, and that was still there after those stories had been read for 3,000 years. History is full of announced endings that turn out, in the genomic record, to be continuations. The Canaanites are one of the clearest examples. The people who were supposed to be destroyed instead became the Phoenicians, who became the Carthaginians, who became the ancestors of modern Levantine populations, who became the genetic heritage of millions of people living in the Eastern Mediterranean today. They were never destroyed. They were never what the destroying narrative needed them to be. They were simply people, living on the coast of the Eastern Mediterranean, whose biological continuity has now been confirmed across 3,000 years of recorded history that insisted, repeatedly and emphatically, that they were gone. The DNA disagrees, and the DNA, as it always does, is right. The Canaanites built cities along the Eastern Mediterranean coast that were among the most sophisticated of the ancient Bronze Age world. Their craftspeople produced the purple dye that became the most expensive commodity in the ancient world. Their alphabet, transmitted through the Phoenician successor culture, became the foundation of every Western writing system. Their trading networks connected Egypt to Mesopotamia, the Aegean to the Arabian Peninsula. They were not a primitive people awaiting replacement. They were, by every material measure, one of the most accomplished civilizations of their era. And the narrative that was constructed to justify their destruction, the theological argument that they were uniquely morally corrupt, uniquely deserving of annihilation, that narrative has been told and retold for 3,000 years. It shaped how scholars approached them, how archaeologists interpreted the sites they left behind, how the entire question of Canaanite identity and survival was framed in the academic and popular literature. The ancient DNA does not erase that narrative, but it places alongside it an incontrovertible biological record. The Canaanites survived. Their children and their children's children and 20 more generations of their descendants are living today in the same cities their ancestors built, carrying in their cells the molecular confirmation of a continuity that 3,000 years of conquests and conversions and changing political names could not interrupt. The people the Bible said were to be gone are still here. They were never what the narrative needed them to be. They were simply people. And people, it turns out, are harder to destroy than any ancient text has ever fully understood.